For 5 years, I drove my father to every appointment, managed his medications, and rearranged my entire life around his needs. My name is Emily Parker, and I was 36 years old when I learned that sacrifice does not always come with the reward people expect. My father's health began declining shortly after his 70th birthday. At first, the changes were small. He forgot medications, missed appointments, and became uncomfortable driving. Gradually, those small problems turned into hospital visits, specialist consultations, physical therapy appointments, and endless medical paperwork. Somehow, without anyone formally asking, the responsibility became mine. Every Tuesday and Thursday I drove him to appointments. Every weekend I cleaned his house, organized prescriptions, bought groceries, and prepared meals for the coming week. Whenever an emergency happened, my phone rang first. There were countless days when I left work early because Dad needed help. Vacations were canceled. Promotions were postponed. Relationships quietly faded because I never seemed to have enough time. Despite the exhaustion, I never regretted caring for him because he was my father and I loved him deeply. The most difficult part was not the physical work, but watching someone you love slowly become dependent on others. Meanwhile, my younger sister Sarah lived nearly 1,000 miles away. According to social media, her life appeared perfect. She traveled frequently, attended dinner parties, enjoyed beach vacations, and constantly posted pictures of new experiences. Whenever Dad asked if she would visit, there was always another excuse. She was too busy, the flights were expensive, the timing was wrong, or she promised to come next month. Over 5 years, she visited only a few times, and each visit lasted only a day or two. Dad never openly criticized her. He always defended her, saying that Sarah had her own life and was doing the best she could. Relatives eventually noticed who was always present. They saw me driving Dad, sitting beside him in hospitals, handling paperwork, and taking responsibility for everything. People often told me that my father was lucky to have me. I appreciated their kindness, but I never expected recognition or payment. Still, if I am honest, I assumed my father's will would reflect the reality everyone had witnessed. 5 years of sacrifice, 5 years of showing up, and 5 years of putting his needs before my own seemed impossible to ignore. Dad passed away peacefully one autumn morning while I was holding his hand. The funeral was difficult but beautiful. Friends shared stories, neighbors paid their respects, and people whose lives he had touched came to say goodbye. 1 week later, our family gathered at a lawyer's office for the reading of his will. The atmosphere felt tense because everyone knew that the estate would finally be discussed. Sarah arrived wearing an expensive designer outfit and carried herself with unusual confidence. At first, I paid little attention to it. The attorney opened the file, adjusted his glasses, and began reading. Everything sounded ordinary until he reached the distribution of the estate. The house went to Sarah. The investment accounts went to Sarah. The savings accounts went to Sarah. Every major asset belonged entirely to Sarah. The room became silent. I felt everyone looking at me, waiting for anger, tears, or an argument. Across the table, Sarah could barely hide her smile. The lawyer finished reading and closed the file. Nobody spoke. Calmly, I reached into my purse and removed a sealed envelope. Placing it on the table, I quietly said, "Before anyone leaves, Dad asked me to share this." Everyone stared at the envelope. Even the attorney seemed surprised. Sarah's smile faded as she asked what it was. I explained that Dad had instructed me to give it to the lawyer only after the will had been read. On the front, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "To be opened only after my will is read." The attorney carefully opened the envelope and began reading the letter. Dad wrote that if the letter was being read, both of his daughters were sitting together, and Emily was probably wondering why everything had been left to Sarah. Every eye turned toward me. The lawyer continued reading. Dad wrote that the decision was never a reflection of who loved him more. He thanked me for 5 years of sacrifice, time, and dedication. He said that I had never asked for recognition or reward, and that I had simply shown up whenever he needed me. Sarah shifted uncomfortably as the words filled the room. Dad also wrote that a person can love their family and still fail to be present when it matters most. Sarah lowered her eyes as the attorney continued to the next page. Then the lawyer's expression changed. He paused, adjusted his glasses, and continued reading. Dad wrote that the estate described in the will was not the entirety of his assets. 7 years earlier, he had established a private trust that nobody knew existed. The trust contained investment holdings, business interests, and additional properties that had intentionally been excluded from probate. Sarah looked up in complete surprise. The attorney continued reading and announced that the trustee and sole controlling beneficiary of the trust was Emily Parker. The room immediately filled with whispers. My aunt gasped, and even I could hardly believe what I was hearing. The attorney opened another folder containing signed and notarized legal documents that confirmed everything. Dad explained that he had carefully chosen this arrangement. The inheritance in the will provided financial resources, but the trust required responsibility, judgment, and long-term stewardship. Tears formed in my eyes because suddenly everything made sense. Every late-night phone call, every appointment, every sacrifice I believed had gone unnoticed had actually been seen. Dad had been paying attention all along. The attorney continued reading the final page of the letter. Dad wrote that Emily had spent 5 years proving she could be trusted with responsibility, and that trust was more valuable than wealth. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Sarah received financial assets, but Dad had placed his confidence and responsibility in me. He wrote that he hoped this arrangement would not divide his daughters, and that both of us would understand that love and trust are not measured in the same way. When the letter ended, silence filled the room. Sarah eventually looked at me. There was no anger in her expression, only shock and perhaps regret. I could have celebrated or reminded everyone who had cared for Dad during those difficult years, but that was never the point. The point was understanding the lesson my father had spent years teaching me. Money can be inherited, but trust must be earned. My sister received an inheritance that made her wealthy, while the trust my father placed in me made me grateful. In the end, that mattered far more than anything written in the will.